When HOA President Margaret demands 10-year prison sentence for 8-year-old disabled Emma's wheelchair use, she has no idea she's threatening a senior family court judge's daughter. One business card reveal will destroy the bully's life forever and transform an entire community in this ultimate revenge story. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. Sarah Martinez wheeled her 8-year-old daughter Emma through the pristine sidewalks of Willowbrook Heights, their upscale gated community. Emma's cerebral palsy meant she couldn't walk, but her bright smile and infectious laughter made everyone who met her fall in love with her spirit. Sarah had moved here specifically for the community's reputation of being family-friendly and inclusive, spending months researching neighborhoods before settling on this one. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns as they made their way toward the community playground. Emma hummed her favorite song while pointing out different flowers in the carefully maintained gardens. Sarah cherished these peaceful moments before her demanding day at the courthouse began. "Mommy, can we go to the playground today?" Emma asked, her words slightly slurred but filled with excitement. "I want to try the new swings again." "Of course, sweetheart. The new accessible swings should be working perfectly by now," Sarah replied, pushing the wheelchair with practiced ease. She remembered the day those swings were installed, how Emma's face had lit up with pure joy at having equipment designed specifically for children like her. As they approached the community playground, Sarah noticed a small crowd gathered around the entrance. Her heart sank when she saw the familiar figure of Margaret Thornfield, the HOA president, standing with her arms crossed and a stern expression on her face. Margaret held a clipboard and was gesturing animatedly while speaking to several neighbors. Margaret was a woman in her late 50s who treated the homeowners association like her personal kingdom. She had short, perfectly styled gray hair that never seemed to move in any weather, and always wore expensive pantsuits that made her look like she was perpetually attending a board meeting. Her cold blue eyes seemed to scan for violations wherever she went, and her thin lips were perpetually pursed in disapproval. She lived alone in the largest house in the community, a sprawling mansion that she'd inherited from her wealthy parents, and seemed to spend most of her time finding fault with her neighbors. "There she is," Margaret announced loudly as Sarah and Emma approached. "The woman who's been violating our community standards for months." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Emma's hand tightened on her favorite stuffed animal, a small purple elephant named Peanut that went everywhere with her. "Excuse me, Margaret? What violation are you talking about?" Margaret pulled out a manila folder thick with papers, photographs, and what appeared to be detailed documentation. "Your daughter has been damaging community property. These tire marks on our pristine sidewalks are unacceptable. The constant wear from that contraption is lowering our property values and creating an eyesore for the entire neighborhood." Emma looked confused and hurt, her big brown eyes filling with tears. "Mommy, what's a contraption? Did I do something wrong?" Sarah's jaw tightened as her protective instincts flared. "It's called a wheelchair, Margaret. And my daughter has every right to use these sidewalks that we pay association fees to maintain." "Not when it's causing property damage," Margaret shot back, her voice becoming shriller. "I've documented every instance over the past 6 months. Scuff marks, worn patches, even some chipped concrete near the mailboxes. Look at these photographs." She thrust a stack of pictures toward Sarah, each one showing minor wear patterns that any reasonable person would consider normal. A few neighbors had gathered, some looking uncomfortable with Margaret's aggressive tone. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman from down the street who always waved at Emma during their morning walks, stepped forward with a frown. "Margaret, that's absolutely ridiculous. The child needs to get around. What do you expect her to do, never leave her house?" Margaret whirled around, her face already flushing red. "I expect people to follow the rules, Helen. We have standards here. This isn't some rundown neighborhood where anything goes. We moved here for the prestige and property values, not to watch them deteriorate because some people think rules don't apply to them." Sarah felt her professional instincts kicking in. After 15 years as a family court judge, she dealt with her share of bullies and had learned to stay calm under pressure. But this wasn't just any case. This was her daughter being attacked by a woman who clearly had no understanding of basic human decency, let alone disability rights. "Margaret, I'd like to see the specific covenant you're referring to that prohibits wheelchair use on community sidewalks." "It's under property damage and maintenance standards," Margaret replied smugly, pulling out a thick binder. "Section 4.7 clearly states that residents are responsible for any damage caused to community property. Your daughter's wheelchair is causing visible damage and you're liable for repairs." Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve with her small hand. "Mommy, I don't want to break anything. Maybe I should stay inside from now on. I don't want to make people angry. Sarah's heart broke hearing her daughter's innocent words. She knelt down to Emma's level, her voice gentle but firm. You haven't broken anything, sweetheart. You have every right to be here and use these sidewalks just like every other child in this community. Margaret wasn't finished with her tirade. Furthermore, I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night. This behavior needs to stop immediately, or I'll be forced to pursue legal action against your family. I won't stand by and watch property values plummet because one family thinks they're above the rules. Legal action? Sarah stood up slowly, her voice dangerously quiet. Against an 8-year-old child with a disability? Against residents who refuse to maintain community standards, Margaret corrected, her voice becoming more aggressive. I don't care about anyone's personal circumstances. Rules are rules and they apply to everyone equally. No exceptions, no sob stories, no special treatment. The crowd was growing larger now as more neighbors emerged from their houses to see what the commotion was about. Mr. Jenkins, a retired veteran who lived 3 houses down and always made a point to chat with Emma during their walks, shook his head in disgust. Margaret, you've gone too far this time. That little girl is a sweetheart. She waves to me every morning when I'm getting my newspaper, and she's always so polite and cheerful. What you're suggesting is completely unreasonable. And I've seen her help Mrs. Chen carry her groceries last week, added another neighbor, a young mother with twin toddlers. She's more helpful and considerate than most adults in this neighborhood. Margaret's face was turning red, her voice rising to an almost shriek. I don't care if she's Mother Teresa reincarnated. The rules apply to everyone equally. No exceptions. If we start making allowances for one person, where does it end? Next thing you know, we'll have people claiming all sorts of disabilities just to avoid following community standards. Sarah pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of the alleged damage Margaret was pointing to. What she saw were normal wear patterns that any pedestrian traffic would cause over time, slight discoloration from foot traffic, minor scuffs that were barely visible, and what appeared to be natural settling of concrete that had nothing to do with wheelchair use. I'll see you at the meeting tomorrow night, Sarah said calmly, her judicial training keeping her voice level despite her growing anger. Emma, let's go home. As they left, Sarah could hear Margaret continuing her rant to anyone who would listen about property values and community standards. She was now pulling out more photographs and pointing at various spots on the sidewalk, her voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. Emma was unusually quiet during the short trip home, her usual cheerful chatter replaced by thoughtful silence. Mommy, why doesn't that lady like me? Emma asked once they were safely inside their house. Did I really break something? I try to be careful with my wheelchair. Sarah sat down next to her daughter and took her small hands in hers. Some people have forgotten how to be kind, sweetheart. But that's their problem, not yours. You haven't done anything wrong, and you have every right to use your wheelchair wherever you need to go. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat in her home office reviewing HOA documents and researching disability rights law. She'd kept her profession private in the neighborhood, preferring to be known simply as Emma's mom rather than Judge Martinez. It allowed her to have normal relationships with neighbors without the formality that often came with her position. But Margaret's behavior was crossing serious legal lines, and Sarah's protective instincts were fully engaged. Sarah spent hours documenting everything, taking detailed photos of the sidewalks, and reviewing the Americans with Disabilities Act. She also pulled up Margaret's social media profiles and was disturbed by what she found. Post after post complaining about various neighbors, calling for stricter enforcement of HOA rules, and making disparaging comments about people she deemed undesirable. There were complaints about Mrs. Chen's garden being too ethnic, criticism of the Rodriguez family's children for playing too loudly, and even negative comments about Mr. Jenkins' service dog. The pattern was clear. Margaret had been systematically harassing multiple families in the community, using HOA rules as a weapon to intimidate anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of acceptable neighbors. Sarah also discovered that Margaret had filed over 30 complaints with the county in the past 2 years, most of which had been dismissed as frivolous. The next evening, the community center was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread about the dispute, and nearly every resident had shown up, many bringing folding chairs from home. Sarah noticed several families she'd never seen at HOA meetings before, including the young couple with twin babies and the elderly Korean couple from the end of the street. Margaret had clearly prepared for battle, arriving with a PowerPoint presentation, a stack of printed materials, and what appeared to be a legal brief. She'd even dressed more formally than usual, wearing a severe black suit that made her look like she was attending a funeral. "Thank you all for coming to this emergency meeting," Margaret began, taking her position at the front of the room like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "We're here tonight to address a serious and ongoing threat to our community's standards and property values." She clicked to her first slide, which showed blown-up photos of minor scuff marks on sidewalks with red circles highlighting areas that looked completely normal to most observers. "As you can see from these documented examples, we have significant property damage being caused by one resident's refusal to control their child's destructive behavior." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Sarah noticed that most people looked uncomfortable with Margaret's presentation rather than supportive. Several neighbors were shaking their heads, and she could hear whispered conversations of disbelief. "The Martinez family has shown complete disregard for our community standards," Margaret continued, advancing to a slide that showed a timeline of alleged incidents. "Despite multiple warnings, they continue to allow destructive behavior that affects all of our property values and violates the covenant agreements we all signed when we purchased our homes here." Sarah raised her hand calmly. "Margaret, could you please specify which warnings you're referring to? I have no record of receiving any official notices from the HOA, and I've kept detailed records of all our correspondence." Margaret fumbled through her papers, clearly not expecting to be challenged on specifics. "Well, there were informal conversations, and I'm sure I mentioned my concerns during casual encounters." "Informal conversations don't constitute official HOA warnings according to our governing documents," Sarah replied smoothly. "Could you also please cite the specific covenant section that prohibits wheelchair use on community sidewalks?" The room fell silent. Margaret's face was growing redder by the minute as she realized her presentation was falling apart under basic scrutiny. "It's not about prohibiting wheelchair use," Margaret snapped, her composure beginning to crack. "It's about taking responsibility for property damage and maintaining the standards we all agreed to uphold." Mr. Jenkins stood up, his military bearing evident even in his civilian clothes. "Margaret, I've lived here for 12 years and I've seen real property damage. Like when the Thompsons' teenage son drove his motorcycle through Mrs. Patterson's flower bed last summer, or when that delivery truck cracked the sidewalk near the mailboxes. What you're showing us tonight is normal wear and tear that happens in any neighborhood where people actually live." "Yeah," called out another voice from the back. "My jogging stroller probably causes more damage than Emma's wheelchair, and I run the same route every morning." Margaret was losing control of the room, her carefully planned presentation crumbling as neighbor after neighbor spoke up. "This isn't about popular opinion. This is about rules and standards. If we make exceptions for one person, where does it end? Today it's wheelchairs, tomorrow it could be motorcycles, skateboards, or who knows what else." Mrs. Chin, an elderly Korean woman who rarely spoke at community meetings due to her limited English, stood up slowly with the help of her husband. In her accented but clear voice she said, "That little girl helped me with groceries last week. She more polite than most adults. She always say hello, always smile. You should be ashamed." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Sarah could see several people nodding vigorously. Margaret was clearly frustrated that her presentation wasn't having the desired effect, and her mask of professional composure was slipping rapidly. "Fine," Margaret said, her voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. "Since you all want to ignore the rules and turn this community into some kind of free-for-all, I'll spell out exactly what's going to happen. I'm filing a formal complaint with the county health department. I'm also pursuing legal action for property damage and violation of covenant agreements. And if that doesn't work, I'll push for criminal charges." The room went dead silent. Even Margaret's few supporters looked shocked at the escalation. Emma, who had been sitting quietly next to Sarah playing with Peanut, looked up with wide, frightened eyes. "Criminal charges?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "Against whom exactly?" "Against you for allowing and enabling destructive behavior, and against your daughter for the actual property damage," Margaret declared, pointing dramatically at Emma. "Age doesn't excuse criminal behavior, and neither does disability." Emma had been sitting quietly next to Sarah, playing with a small toy and only half understanding the adult conversation. But at Margaret's words, she looked up with wide, frightened eyes and started to cry. "Criminal charges against an 8-year-old with cerebral palsy for using a wheelchair?" Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath that made several people in the audience sit up straighter. "Age and disability don't excuse destructive behavior," Margaret declared, warming to her theme. "I want her prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I want her sentenced to juvenile detention." 10 years should be enough time to teach her to respect other people's property and follow community rules. The room erupted. Several people started shouting at Margaret simultaneously, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of outrage. Mrs. Peterson stood up and pointed an accusatory finger at Margaret. "You're talking about sending a disabled child to prison for using a wheelchair? Have you completely lost your mind?" Margaret raised her voice over the chaos, her face now bright red with anger and adrenaline. "The law is the law. Actions have consequences. Just because someone has a disability doesn't mean they get to destroy other people's property without facing justice." Emma started crying harder, her small voice barely audible over the shouting. "Mommy, I don't want to go to prison. I didn't mean to break anything. I'll stay inside forever if that lady wants me to." Sarah gathered her daughter close, her own anger building to a level she rarely allowed herself to feel. She'd remained professional up to this point, but Margaret had just crossed a line that no parent could tolerate. The protective fury of a mother combined with the legal expertise of a judge was a formidable combination. "Emma, sweetheart, you're not going to prison. You haven't done anything wrong." Sarah's voice was gentle with her daughter, but her eyes were fixed on Margaret with laser focus. Margaret seemed to interpret Sarah's calm demeanor as weakness and pressed her advantage. "Don't make promises you can't keep. I have connections in the legal system. I know judges and prosecutors personally. Your daughter will learn that actions have consequences, regardless of her disability." "Judges and prosecutors," Sarah repeated slowly, her voice taking on a different quality that made the room gradually quiet. "That's very interesting." "That's right," Margaret said smugly, clearly feeling she had gained the upper hand. "My ex-husband is a prominent lawyer in this city, and I know exactly how the system works. I've already started making calls. Criminal charges will be filed by the end of the week." Sarah stood up slowly, still holding Emma protectively. "Margaret, before you make any more calls, I think there's something you should know about me. Unless you're planning to pay for complete sidewalk replacement and punitive damages, I don't care what you have to say," Margaret replied dismissively. Sarah pulled out her wallet and removed a business card with deliberate, careful movements. She walked calmly to the front of the room, her heels clicking on the polished floor, and handed it to Margaret. The room was now completely silent, everyone sensing that something significant was about to happen. Margaret glanced at the card dismissively, then did a double take. Her face went pale as she read the embossed text. "The Honorable Sarah Martinez, Senior Family Court Judge, County Superior Court." "You're?" Margaret's voice cracked, the word barely escaping her throat. "A sitting judge, yes. Specifically, a senior family court judge who specializes in cases involving children with disabilities." Sarah's voice remained calm, but the entire room was now hanging on every word. "I've been on the bench for 15 years, and I've handled thousands of cases involving child welfare and disability rights." Margaret looked like she was going to be sick. The blood had drained from her face, and her hands were visibly shaking as she stared at the business card. I didn't know. I had no idea." "No, you didn't know. Just like you didn't know that what you've just proposed constitutes harassment of a disabled child under federal law. You also didn't know that threatening criminal prosecution without legal basis is considered abuse of process, which is a serious offense." The room was dead silent except for Emma sniffling. Sarah continued, her judicial training evident in her measured tone and precise language. "You've also just committed what could be considered intimidation of a witness, since you've threatened legal action against my daughter for exercising her constitutional rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act." Margaret was now visibly shaking, her carefully constructed confidence completely shattered. This was just... I was just trying to protect property values. By threatening to have an 8-year-old disabled child sentenced to 10 years in juvenile detention?" Sarah let that sink in, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "Margaret, do you understand what you've just said in front of 47 witnesses?" Sarah had been quietly counting the crowd during Margaret's presentation, her judicial habits running deep even in personal situations. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Margaret started desperately. "No misunderstanding. You clearly stated that you wanted my daughter sentenced to 10 years in juvenile detention for using her wheelchair on public sidewalks. You also claimed to have connections in the legal system that you plan to use to achieve this goal. Every word has been heard by multiple witnesses." Mr. Jenkins stood up, holding his phone. "I recorded the whole thing. Every single word, from the moment you started threatening that little girl." Several other people held up their phones. "So did we." Margaret looked around the room frantically, finally realizing the magnitude of her mistake. This was taken out of context. What context would make threatening a disabled child with imprisonment acceptable? Sarah asked, her voice remaining calm but relentless. Emma had stopped crying and was watching the exchange with fascination. At 8 years old, she didn't fully understand the legal implications, but she could tell that the mean lady was in serious trouble, and her mommy was somehow very important. Margaret tried a different approach, her voice becoming pleading. Look, Judge Martinez, I respect your position, but surely you understand the importance of maintaining community standards. Do you respect my position? Because threatening legal action against a judge's family could also be construed as attempted intimidation of a judicial officer, which is a federal crime punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Margaret's lawyer ex-husband had apparently never explained to her that threatening judges or their families was one of the most serious crimes in the legal system. I withdraw my complaint, Margaret said quickly, panic evident in her voice. Which complaint would that be? The HOA complaint? The county complaint you mentioned? The criminal charges you wanted to pursue? Or the federal civil rights violations you've just committed? Margaret realized she was trapped in her own words, each statement she'd made digging her deeper into legal quicksand. All of them. I withdraw everything. This was all a big misunderstanding. Unfortunately, Margaret, it's not that simple. You've made public threats against a disabled child. You've claimed to have inappropriate influence over the legal system. You've attempted to intimidate a judicial officer. These aren't things that can just be withdrawn like a library book. The crowd was mesmerized. Many had never seen Margaret backed into a corner like this before, and they were witnessing the complete dismantling of a bully who had terrorized their community for years. Sarah continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used in her courtroom. You've also violated several federal laws tonight. The Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits harassment of individuals based on their disability. Your threats constitute a clear pattern of harassment and discrimination. Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. Mommy, what's harassment? It's when someone repeatedly bothers or threatens another person just because they're different, sweetheart. It's not allowed, and there are laws to protect people from bullies. Margaret made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. This whole thing has been blown out of proportion. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just trying to protect our community. You never meant to what? Get caught. Mrs. Peterson called out from the audience. Sarah held up a hand for silence, and the room immediately quieted. Margaret, I want to be very clear about something. My daughter has every legal right to use her wheelchair anywhere in this community. Any attempt to restrict that access is a federal civil rights violation punishable by significant fines and imprisonment. I understand that now. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Do you? Because earlier tonight you demanded that she be imprisoned for exercising those rights. You also threatened to use your alleged connections in the legal system to pursue criminal charges against an 8-year-old child. Margaret was now crying, her makeup running down her cheeks. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted. How far did you mean for it to go? At what point would threatening an 8-year-old disabled child with 10 years in prison have been acceptable to you? The question hung in the air like a sword. Margaret had no answer because there wasn't one, and everyone in the room knew it. Sarah picked up Emma and addressed the room. I want to thank everyone who spoke up for Emma tonight. It means more than you know to see a community come together to protect one of its most vulnerable members. As she started to leave, Margaret called out desperately, "What happens now? What are you going to do?" Sarah turned back, her expression showing a mixture of judicial authority and maternal protection. Now you live with the consequences of your choices. Just like you wanted Emma to do. Over the next few days, word spread throughout the community and beyond about what had happened at the HOA meeting. Margaret's behavior became the talk of not just the neighborhood, but social media platforms where the video had been shared thousands of times. Sarah received visits from several neighbors apologizing for not speaking up sooner about Margaret's aggressive behavior toward various residents. It turned out that Emma wasn't Margaret's first target. She'd been systematically harassing families for years over increasingly minor issues. Mrs. Chun brought homemade cookies and told Sarah through her grandson's translation that Margaret had once tried to have her fined for hanging laundry outside because it looked ethnic and violated the aesthetic standards of the community. Mr. Jenkins revealed that Margaret had attempted to ban his service dog from community areas, claiming the dog was disruptive to property values. The Rodriguez family shared that Margaret had filed noise complaints about their children playing in their own backyard during daylight hours. Even the elderly Mrs. Patterson admitted that Margaret had criticized her rose garden for attracting too many bees, claiming they were a public nuisance. A week later, Sarah received a certified letter delivered by a very nervous-looking process server. Margaret was formally resigning from the HOA board and moving out of the community within 30 days. The letter included a public apology to Emma, a donation check to the local Cerebral Palsy Foundation, and a legal waiver accepting full responsibility for her actions. But the real change came from the community itself. The HOA board, now free from Margaret's authoritarian influence, voted unanimously to update their covenants to explicitly protect the rights of residents with disabilities. They also installed additional accessible equipment at the playground, created designated accessible parking spaces throughout the community, and established a community fund to help families with disabled children access needed resources. Emma, meanwhile, had become something of a neighborhood celebrity. Children who had previously been shy around her wheelchair now asked for rides and wanted to learn about her condition. The elderly residents made a point of waving enthusiastically when she passed by, and several families started leaving small gifts on their doorstep. Mrs. Patterson, inspired by Emma's resilience, started a community garden specifically designed to be accessible for people with disabilities. The Rodriguez children appointed themselves as Emma's official playground bodyguards, making sure she was included in every game and activity. 1 month after the infamous HOA meeting, Sarah was pushing Emma through the community when they encountered a new family moving in. The parents had a teenage son who used crutches due to a sports injury and seemed nervous about fitting into the community. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Sarah called out warmly. "I'm Sarah and this is Emma." The mother smiled gratefully. "Thank you. I'm Lisa and this is my son Jake. We heard this was a very inclusive community but we weren't sure." Emma waved enthusiastically from her wheelchair. "It is. Everyone here is really nice now. Well, except for this one mean lady, but she moved away, and now we have a playground that everyone can use." Jake grinned, immediately put at ease by Emma's infectious enthusiasm. "What happened to the mean lady?" Emma thought for a moment, her face serious. "My mommy is a judge and she explained to the mean lady that being mean to kids is against the law. The mean lady didn't know that, but she learned really fast." Sarah laughed, ruffling her daughter's hair. "That's a simplified version, but essentially accurate." Later that evening, as Sarah was tucking Emma into bed, her daughter asked, "Mommy, why didn't you tell me you were a judge before that meeting?" "I wanted you to know me as your mom first, sweetheart. My job is important, but being your mother is the most important thing I do." Emma smiled, her eyes bright with understanding beyond her years. "I'm glad you're both. That mean lady was really scared when she found out, wasn't she?" She was surprised, yes. Sometimes people behave badly when they think no one important is watching. But the truth is, everyone is important, and everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and respect. "Good. She was being really mean to me and being mean is wrong no matter who you are." Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead. "You're absolutely right. Being mean is wrong and no one should have to accept being treated badly just because they're different." As Sarah turned off the lights, Emma called out sleepily, "Mommy? I love living here now. Everyone waves at me and the kids at the playground all want to be my friend." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." 3 months later, Sarah received an unexpected phone call at her courthouse office. It was from a national disability rights organization that had heard about the HOA incident through social media. "Judge Martinez, we'd like to invite you to speak at our annual conference about legal advocacy for families with disabled children. Your response to that woman's threats has become a rallying cry for parents across the country." Sarah was honored but surprised. "How did you hear about what happened?" "Someone posted a video of the HOA meeting online. It's gone viral with over 5 million views. Your response to that woman's threats has inspired countless families to stand up for their rights and demand better treatment for their children." Sarah had no idea that Mr. Jenkins had posted his recording on multiple social media platforms. She watched it that evening and was amazed to see it had garnered millions of views and hundreds of thousands of supportive comments from around the world. The video showed the exact moment when Margaret's arrogance crumbled upon learning Sarah's true identity. Comments poured in from parents of disabled children sharing their own stories of discrimination and expressing gratitude for seeing someone stand up to a bully so effectively. Emma watched the video with fascination, reading comments over Sarah's shoulder. "Mommy, we're famous. Look, this lady says I inspired her daughter to stand up to bullies at school." "I suppose we are, sweetheart. Can I read more of the comments?" Sarah scrolled through, finding dozens of messages from children with disabilities saying Emma had inspired them to be proud of who they were. Parents wrote about showing the video to schools and organizations that had discriminated against their children, often with positive results. One comment particularly touched Sarah. "My daughter has spina bifida and uses a wheelchair. After watching this video, she asked me why she should be ashamed of needing her chair. I realized I'd been inadvertently teaching her to apologize for her existence. Thank you for showing us what advocacy looks like and for raising such a brave little girl." 6 months after the incident, Willowbrook Heights had transformed into a model inclusive community that was featured in national publications as an example of how neighborhoods could embrace diversity and accessibility. The HOA board had created an accessibility committee that Emma served on as their youngest member, testing playground equipment and suggesting improvements. Margaret's former house had been purchased by a family with twin boys who had autism. The community welcomed them with open arms, having learned valuable lessons about acceptance, inclusion, and the importance of standing up for those who might be different. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the transformation, crediting Emma's courage and Sarah's advocacy with creating a ripple effect that had changed not just their community, but inspired similar changes in neighborhoods across the region. Sarah often reflected on that night at the HOA meeting. Margaret's biggest mistake wasn't just threatening Emma, it was assuming that a quiet single mother would be an easy target. She'd picked the wrong fight with the wrong person at the wrong time, but perhaps more importantly, she'd underestimated the power of a community when it finally decides to stand up to a bully. But the incident had revealed something beautiful about their neighborhood. When faced with injustice, the neighbors had spoken up. They'd chosen kindness over compliance, inclusion over exclusion, and love over fear. Emma continued to thrive, her confidence growing stronger each day. She'd learned that she had rights, that those rights were worth defending, and that there were people willing to defend them. More importantly, she'd learned that being different wasn't something to apologize for, it was something to celebrate. One evening, as they walked through their neighborhood during the golden hour, Emma pointed to Margaret's former house where the new family was playing in the yard. "Mommy, do you think that mean lady learned her lesson?" Sarah considered the question carefully, watching the twin boys play while their parents watched with loving smiles. "I hope so, sweetheart. Sometimes people need to face serious consequences before they understand that their actions hurt others. But the important thing is that our community learned something too. I'm glad she moved away, but I'm also glad it all happened." "Why's that?" Emma smiled, her wisdom shining through despite her young age. "Because now everyone knows that kids like me belong here too. And maybe other kids like me won't have to be scared anymore because people saw what happened to someone who tried to bully us." Sarah hugged her daughter close, proud of her resilience and grateful for the community that had rallied around them. Sometimes justice came in unexpected ways, delivered not through lengthy court proceedings but through the simple power of truth spoken at exactly the right moment by someone who refused to let a bully win. The video of that HOA meeting continued to inspire families around the world, but for Sarah and Emma, the real victory was simpler and more profound. They'd found their home had found them, and together they'd created a place where every child could belong.